Hello, this is Dr. Jayne Dubois coming to your ears live from real life. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Cosmic Joke, a show of deep talks punctuated by hysterical laughter. Every episode, my guests and I try to answer the questions, what is the cosmic joke? Is it funny? And am I the punchline? Stay tuned. During this episode, I'm going to be interviewing a good friend of mine, Glen Gonzalez, who is this extremely talented and wise social worker. He's a professor at the University of Washington here in Seattle and just a general badass. So his life is super interesting and his perspective on life is even more interesting. And I'm so excited for you to listen to us chat. So here he is.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that. That was great.
Glen, tell us about yourself. Even though I
myself.
just said 2 sentences. Let's expand.
Okay, let's see. I think you hit it all. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a father of 2 daughters, which is a big part of my identity. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, and that's also a part of my identity. And yeah, as you said, a social worker by a bit in the field of social services for close to 20 years now, actually, which is surprising because I don't feel that old, but I guess I am. So yeah, been doing that. I worked in child services for a while. We want to get into that kind of stuff?
We can.
Or just recovery, I don't know.
All of it. We're just going to go wherever we feel like going.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting, just even in what you've said so far, what I think when I hear veteran and when I hear social worker is glutton for punishment.
Absolutely.
And takes one to know one,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm over here having cried every day for 5 years in a graduate program and former gymnast. So I know about the glutton for punishment, but I'm wondering what was the draw and what is the joke in that for you? Do you know what I mean? Because
I do, yeah.
I think we get into some of those lines of work because there's a part of us that is super serious still. And then you get into it and you realize that it's at least for me, it was just way deeper and more fucked up than I ever could have possibly imagined. And there is no fixing it. So those of us who are pretty idealistic, for me, the
Absolutely.
cosmic joke lived in that process of finding that out.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of why I got into social work specifically was I grew up in LA and I got in some trouble as a youth and I was in the system. And so abuse and neglect is a part of my upbringing. And so someone took a chance on me. The judicial system, I also had social worker that was a big mentor for me growing up. And I knew at that point I wanted to do something along that line, those lines. And then I found myself in a situation where I kind of had to join the Army. I didn't know anything out of my small box of LA, my little corner. And then seeing stuff on a global level, when I was in Kosovo or Bosnia in the refugee camps there, and I knew, I want to do something about this. But yeah, the joke, I suppose, for me is thinking well, first of all, just going home and talking to all my homies from back in the streets, they had no idea. I would be hey, you guys know what's going on in Bosnia? And they're like, where's Bosnia? What's Bosnia? No one even knew, right? And I was like, whoa, this is eye-opening. And I just knew I wanted to be involved, seeing what life was like for those folks in the refugee camps and around the world, because it gave me perspective of what I thought was a horrible life or a tough life. Not to take away from anyone's individual experiences or my own, but I was able to see a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just kind of dove into that and then got out of the military, jumped into college, psychology for undergrad, social work for graduate school. And I wanted to make a change. I wanted to make a difference. And again, another part of that joke is you can only do so much, but if you impact one life, then that's a success. And that sounds cliche, but that's what kept me going, because you'll get your heart broken if you think you're going to change the system overnight or change everything. You just do the little bit that you can. And that's been my driving force. So I've just kind of been doing that ever since. And then there's the paradox between that, like you said, the veteran and social worker, because stereotypically one's more conservative thinking and one's more maybe liberal thinking. And so, those two thought processes exist within my own mind, where I'm constantly well, I like guns, but I'm also all about peace, right? And,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of things go like that with me. Same thing with certain policies out there. I'm I understand that, but also, I think this way. I tend to lean towards the left, but I definitely have some more especially as I'm getting older, I'm noticing I'm like, oh, I'm a little more thinking differently on certain topics and stuff like that. So yeah, that's always funny to me to see that process unravel.
Yeah. And how do you feel like that plays out in like outside of your own mind? Like when you're encountering things that like you have an issue with, how do you sort of work through it to be able to just like interact with the general public, as we do?
Absolutely. One thing I left out of my story is, I touched on it briefly, is recovery is a big part of my story. So I'm clean and sober for a little over 6 years now. Hey, thank you. And I've developed in that a great community. So like there's folks that I can talk to, yourself included, and your husband included, and many other people I consider dear friends that if shit hits the fan. Am I allowed to swear on here?
Yes.
If shit hits the fan, I could always call and check in with someone, or I could check in with my spiritual practice, which is like my higher power, God, which is regular for me. And yeah, so I just run things by that. And it seems, and then I'm learning to pause. All right. So whenever I get a spark of a feeling of something, I've learned to like stop and not necessarily react or respond right away. That's been crucial in this whole process for me. So that helps. And when I come across things, I ponder it, and I'm able to see different sides of things now. Before, like especially if it aligned with like, let's say my political beliefs, I was like, this is the right answer. Anyone else that disagrees, I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. But now I'm actually seeing things. I'm like, oh, like I see your side. I see your point. That's a good point, Yeah. And I could accept some of that. Yeah, it's good to allow things to coexist. Before it had to be one or the other.
Yeah, I think it is pretty relaxing to like hold ideas more loosely, and that may just be a product of like getting our asses kicked over time.
Absolutely.
But I do think like one thing that I think is so interesting about you is that even though you had all of these painful experiences in your background, like there is a real emotional maturity to the way that you carry yourself that you don't always see even in people who are in the helping professions. And it's just been such a pleasure to have you in my inner circle, because you're like on the top of my go-to calls, both professionally and personally.
Thank you.
And it's, like I remember specifically, I hope this is okay to roll out. Please. We can always edit out. But
if you make me cry, we just edit that out, please.
So when Mariah went missing, that was during 2020, right?
Yeah.
That was like in the height of COVID. It was such a mess. So I ended up rolling with you all after we found her to Harborview so that we could like do a full check. And we were all sitting in this exam room, and she was like still pretty defensive and like, just like at the very beginning of that reintegration process. And I remember her like talking some shit to you and saying like, hey, I just came home because somebody told me that you were like vulnerable to a relapse, but like I can leave at any time.
Yeah.
And I felt my own knee jerk of assholery come to the forefront and like, sort of like bristled and wanted to defend like the parental status quo, I guess, which is always like, I always feel kind of self-conscious when it happens because I'm like, fuck, I wish that was not my reflex, But you were like, wow, that's really good information for me to have. Thank you for telling me that. And I was like, oh my God, he's such a ninja, dude. Like, what the fuck? I can't believe that was maybe it was your second thought and not your first one.
Absolutely.
And I just happened to see your second thought, but it was very beautifully executed. And to like, to have all of this programming prior to a huge turnaround in your own life and to be able to like roll out the better version of yourself in most scenarios, like that is some unicorn shit. You know what I mean? It's just so fun to watch for me.
Oh, I appreciate that. And well, first of all, I have to acknowledge that, like, again, like you're on my top of my list of people I call, including that particular incident. Yeah. So just know that when the worst nightmare of a parent happens, there's a few people that you could turn to count on. I fortunately was surrounded by great people that were supportive.
That was amazing.
Like the fact that you showed up the way that you did during that very difficult time meant a lot to me. Even to the point where you're a doctor and you showed up to my house after I wasn't sleeping or eating, and you like did an exam in my garage, and you're like, looked like a flashlight in my eyes, and like all like you're like, okay, like here, take some of these and take some. Like I needed that, and knowing that you were there on that level meant the world to me. And then also showing up at the emergency exam after she would returned. Yeah. And so thank you.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Thank you for like letting me in too. You know what I mean? Because so many people, when they're in that type of a situation, they don't ask. You know what I mean? Like they just try to muscle through it alone. And so like that's been one of the most beautiful parts of our friendship, I think, is that has not been even close to the only time that something like that has happened for one or both of us and our families. And just to be able to know that there's a short list of people who will drop everything and show up, no questions asked, and just like roll out whatever strengths and assets they have to offer, like family of choice. You know, it's the best thing ever.
No, without a doubt. I think that's one of the gifts of I don't know what to call it, the metamorphosis or the growth or evolution of myself, where historically I wouldn't ask for help from anyone.
Yeah.
I'm very introverted, believe it or not. A lot of people don't believe that because I'm sort of outgoing, but I like to consider myself maybe a outgoing introvert.
Yeah, same.
So hard for me to ask for help, but I know now there's certain things that I'm like, it's my default.
Yeah.
Like if certain X, Y, or Z happens, like I will ask for help. Or if I'm feeling a certain way, I will ask for help. It's still hard on a lot of other levels. Again, and then those who've experienced trauma or PTSD, it's one of our symptoms is to not do that either. We kind of turn inward, which that compounded with being an introvert could be very isolating.
Yeah.
So the fact that there's some people that I could be vulnerable with, because you need to feel safe in order to be vulnerable. And so the fact that I have those relationships now is the world of difference. And so then I don't feel alone. And it helps so many things. Yeah, but that was a hard time. I don't remember my first thought in that particular instance when I was in the ER room there when she said that. But I know regularly, just having raised two teenage girls, that the first thought, is not usually the best one to vocalize because it could get me in trouble.
I mean, I didn't even twitch. Yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah. I was like, whoa.
Sometimes it's better than it looks better than others, and sometimes you need to step back, which is another thing that I've learned to do now is like, and same thing, making a mistake and then being like, hey, I made a mistake. I would like to take a moment and to make this right, or come back and make this right. Something I wasn't able to do in the past.
Yeah. I guess, one of my big questions for you, both like professionally and personally, is like either you are the person you're encountering, like your kids or your clients, like is just so deep in it that they do not get the fucking joke. Like, how do you sort of usher them through that time and possibly introduce some levity, both so that you can stand sitting with it and so that they can stand living it? And then like, yeah, I forget what the second part was, so let's just start there.
I think that's a great question, and I'm not sure how to. I think it varies, like how you do that in different situations. But I'm a big fan of asking people questions in a way that allows them to kind of see things from a different perspective. Like, oh, like okay, like you're feeling this way, or you're stuck on this certain thing, and then dig deeper to get them to open up in a different way. And then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So what you're saying is this. And I know that sounds very, there's some terms that every therapist knows, like, how does that make you feel? Or like, all those types of things. But a lot of them are great because they do get people to think about things. And that, then I think as people tell their story from a different angle, they're able to see the joke or they're able to see the answer in some of the ways. And so my role when I'm in that situation is to facilitate that as best I can in a way that seems natural, because like if you're like sound like you're reading from a textbook, like no one's gonna go for that. So I do it just like you and I are talking, like we have a conversation, it flows like, oh, that's fascinating. Like, so you're telling me that when this happens to you, like you feel that way, and I'm like, okay, so like what other things do you feel when something, and then just like I'm curious, it's showing up with curiosity, and then they see that and they pick up that vibe, and then they're like, wow, this, and then they start responding in a certain way. I'm like, let's get it going, let's flow. And I do that with my clients too when I was doing clinical social work. I don't just read through a questionnaire. I actually will have a questionnaire in my hand. I'm like, look, I'm supposed to answer all these things, but I'm going to put this down. I want you to tell me like, what's going on.
Yeah.
Why are you here? Right? And then they're like, oh, okay. Yeah. And then you see the guard get a little lighter. And you just got to listen. And then when you hear something that's along the lines of what I need to fill out in that questionnaire, I say, oh, like, tell me more about that, right? I want to know more about that, Yeah. So, yeah.
I do a similar thing with patients at the very first visit where I say, like, you just dump and tell me everything you think I need to know, and then I'll ask questions after that. And it helps them, like, just get out whatever is the most important thing to them. But for me, one thing that I find is, like, when I am wearing that clinical hat, it is so easy to give people like all of the latitude in the world. But when you are sharing a fucking bathroom with somebody,
Sure.
that is not the space that I'm in. So like, what is it for me? Sometimes I feel like at home, being a clinician, it not only doesn't help, but it like sometimes gets in the way because I can't compartmentalize. Like all my shit is in my face and just like flying around the room. And how do I like find the levity in that to not take myself so seriously so that I can show up for an interaction without being a dick?
Absolutely.
Frankly, I fail most of the time. I'm just curious what that looks like for you.
I doubt that you fail that most of the time, but letting things go. Picking and choosing your battles. That's what I want this to come down for me, because again, no one could push my buttons better than my 16-year-old daughter, for example. All right. Like she knows exactly what to do, what to say that could get me tug on the heartstrings, or she even knows she's so smart that she's even learned how to play my ego, which is like, if you could play my ego, which is it exists, like we all have egos, but mine's there, is very present. And she's like, "Oh, Dad, you're so good at this or whatever." And then, but she does it in a way, but it's not even that obvious anymore. She's gotten so good at it where it's not like, "Oh, you look great today. Can I have $5?" It's not that. Like I'd be like, "No, you're playing me." She does it in a way that's masterful, right? And then if I don't go along with whatever it is that she's seeking after that, then the conflict can arise. Mm-hmm. She's like, "Oh, let's say she gets to the point of like, can I spend the night at a friend's house or something like that?" And it's a night that wouldn't be the best idea or whatever. And it might create an argument or a conflict. And so that's when I dial into some of my resources and skills and stuff like that. And we have a discussion. I've learned changing the environment is the key when it comes to that situation. So if you're arguing in the living room all the time, you need to get the heck out of that living room. And what we do now, we call it daddy-daughter drives. And we jump in the car and we drive, and we live in Woodinville, so we could go on a country road and not that far of a drive. And we just talk. And we don't return home until there's some type of resolution, even if that resolution is we don't agree. Yeah. But that's okay. Mm-hmm. And to be okay with that, but that we both feel like we've exhausted our side of the story. Mm-hmm. And then we do at the questions, which is where the clinical piece comes in of like, do you feel like I heard everything that you had to say? Yeah. And then she's like, yes. And I still might be like, I don't agree, but I heard everything, and vice versa. That helps. And then there's certain things when we argue, I'm like, I'm just not going to get into this one with you. And that will piss her off too sometimes, or and I'm like, well, that's okay. Like I don't have more to say about that, because you do have to have boundaries. And there's, as a parent, especially, there are certain. It's not like your friend or colleague or client. You're still the parent. So there's this level of like, hey, like there's the line, and we're not going to cross that line. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answered you.
No, it totally does. It's amazing. And I still you're such a unicorn, Glenn. You don't even know. Can we talk about me? Can we workshop something?
Yeah. What do you got? Let's do it, please.
So I love hearing your parenting perspective, because you have done the blended family game too, right? Which is the situation that I'm in at home. So my husband's 16-year-old son, Jackson, lives with us full time. Yes. He had a pretty rough year. And I think all clinicians had a rough year. So just like the burnout for me from just kind of sitting with some really dark spaces for people at work and then coming home to teen crisis, that's a lot. He just did some really 16-year-old shit. And there was just something in me that kind of snapped. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'm done. Just hustling for your ass when you're going to do some crazy shit. You know what I mean? You're on your own. I saw this meme where they were talking about parenting teenagers, and they were like, when you push your mom so far that she says do whatever you want, just fine. And you think that's good, but it's actually the worst. Mm-hmm. That's sort of how I've been feeling. And I'm wondering if that scenario has ever come up for you, both with Cynthia, right? Because the genetics weren't there for you and Cynthia. Mm-hmm. And so even though you guys were together from such a young age for her, for me, sometimes I notice that the lack of biology is a real barrier in a way that I can't tell if I am making it a bigger deal in my head than it is, or if it is a real issue. And then there's no formula because everybody does this differently and every blended family is differently. So like the perfectionist in me doesn't have like a fucking bar to set anywhere. Like there's no line. I'm just shooting from the hip, feeling some crazy feelings and trying not to be the one acting like a teenager in the room all the time, And like I had no idea that watching teenage development like up close was going to be so triggering for me. So having all these like really historical things come up and trying to be the grown up is like gymnastics on a level that I feel like I do not have a handbook for. So like, what do you has there ever been like sort of a long-standing beef or like something that you thought you should let go of, but you could not?
Absolutely.
For me, I'm like waiting out the clock for like something to shift and like just trying to keep my mouth shut as much as possible in the meantime, because I don't want to make it worse. But like I'm grinding something out in real time. Ooh, it's not cute.
Well, no, so you brought up so many different things that I don't even know where to begin.
I know, complexity.
It's complex, but those are all seriously valid and understandable issues. So I'm going to try and pick them apart from what I understood from what you were saying. So
let's go.
I'd say the one of the things I heard several times is that, first of all, being a step parent, that's its own. They deserve the capes, the all the things, because it's such a difficult position to be in. Not having that biological, or even, it also depends on the age of the child, like when you entered their life and whatnot. So developmentally, that has a big deal with the connection and bond and how they're going to perceive your presence, your authority, and all that. So coming in, let's see, how old was Jackson when you came in the picture?
He was 8.
He was 8. So he's like in his 3rd or 4th major developmental phase by then, right? So the initial bonding that happens by the age of 3 is long gone. All right. So yeah, that's so challenging because so it's hard enough to be a parent. Like a lot of the issues you brought up, every parent deals with. Like, how do I do this? But you missed that initial bonding. So it's like you're starting off at 8. So there's no cooing and there's no cuddling and there's no like those stages weren't there for you. So that's super challenging. And I wish there was an answer, right?
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, I know there's
as that.
I feel like I have sort of accepted the fact, actually, that step parenting is fundamentally impossible. And so that, for me, is the joke, where it's like sometimes something comes up and I'm like, fuck, he's just going to have to take this up with his therapist because I got nothing. Like, I'm here and I am pissed. That is all I know. And like, it may not get better than that for right now.
I mean, but also, so in my years as a social worker, I did a lot of work with foster youth. And they're in a semi-similar situation, right? Where you're, as a foster parent or potentially an adoptive parent, you're getting that child at a different later stage in their life. And this is where I dial in and focus on resiliency theory, which I'm a big fan of. And one of the 3 components of resiliency theory that I will talk about right now is having a positive adult role model in your life. So that's one of the 3 things that contribute to someone being resilient. So just being that, just being you, went to college, successful, in recovery, shows up, loyal, loving, adventurous, has a sense of humor, is not afraid to be human. And that, like you said, hustling for him, like all those things and 100 more that you're doing, that in itself is more than anything that anyone could expect or want. And that is the gift that you're passing on to him. Like him seeing that and that presence is what will contribute to him becoming a resilient and successful adult. All the other stuff in the between, the arguing and the disagreements and the reacting a certain way or whatnot, that's really not what it's about. I mean, but we tend to focus on those, especially when you mention you're a perfectionist, right? Because you're well, these are the issues.
Right.
I would like to fix them. Yeah, exactly, right? But when we do that, we lose track of like, you just showing up every day is more than, that's amazing.
Yeah. It's funny because like right before this last like little teenage moment that kind of like broke me a little, I had said to him, like, look, our relationship is just like fundamentally a little weird, because I'm like sort of a stand-in role in some ways, and in other ways we are not related. So it's like very strange, but we see each other all the time. And I'm not planning on this being cute right now, And so like, do your worst. We're going to butt heads. And I'm not going to go anywhere. Like, that's really the bottom line. I can't promise that I am going to be happy with you, even 50% of the time, So I think I didn't realize how profound, like the commitment part of being in a marriage is, just because like that creates a container of safety for people to like really roll out the crazy.
Yeah.
And then you can deal with it, you know? So there is something like incredibly intimate about seeing somebody's worst and having somebody see you at your worst and like sticking it out. I don't like it, even though it is what I chose, and I'm glad I chose it. Isn't that so ironic? That to me, I think, is the cosmic joke.
That's a good
right?
cosmic joke. And that's such a great metaphor or example of what this life is about right there. Like literally, like you don't like it, but you're so glad that you're doing it.
Yep.
Absolutely. That is essential to doing this thing, is to be able to see it like that you might not like it, but like growth. Like I'm a big fan of evolution too, right? Like the concept of it. And I mean that, and like, it's not a comfortable thing. It's challenging. It's we like, I doubt that the tadpole that grew legs was happy about that. The first tadpole that was like, I need to get out of this place and go thrive somewhere else. That must have been a painful experience. Like, ouch. Like, and now you're in this whole new environment and they're a frog and they're happy and hopping around, right? But like, that's what you're going through. You're growing. And you're growing legs.
Yeah, I'm growing, Glenn. I'm growing.
You are.
I hate it.
And the growth wouldn't happen otherwise, right? If it was all butterflies and sweetness and like all the good, no arguments with that, where would your growth be? What would be sparking that?
Yeah.
So that is essential to this thing. And it's one of those things that you'll look back, like purpose is so important. It's what makes life worth living. And you have many purposes going on for you. Some people have none. You have many. But one of the best ones, I think, that most people can accomplish is when they become a parent or some type of parent, right? Because that is now a purpose where you're like, it's a hard thing, but you're contributing to the well-being and growth of another individual that ideally will make this world a better place.
I may or may not call that Operation Don't Raise a Douchebag.
That's a good name for that. I'm a fan of that. And you might not know, it might be a long time before you see that operation come to fruition, right? It's not going to be like, oh, you're 18, boom, there you go.
Yes, that's so true. And actually, I have people say that this is a thing, and I always kind of rolls my eyes at it. But like, I have so much of a different perspective on my relationship with my mom in particular going through this, because we had dinner with her over the weekend on Sunday night, and she was like, listen, I really would like you all to consider having Jackson come live with me when he turns 18, just so that he can have like a little stepping stone. And it was so funny because my mom and I, like when I was this age, part of the reason why just like watching his development is so intense for me is because like it was a really stormy time for me where I was like really on the precipice and just like rolled out all of my dark side that I had been really trying to lock up as like a goody two-shoes little kid for most of my childhood. So my mom and I butted heads all the time. It was just like such a fraught relationship. And that lasted until I was probably at least 26. And even after that, like we had a lot of stuff to work out, a lot of dances to do. And it's taken years. Like I'm 37, right? And like just now in that moment when she was like, this is what I think, she's doing me a solid, right? Like she's doing that for me, like it, because she can, and because it would be fun for her too, but she's doing it for me. And I was just sitting there thinking like, man, my childhood is forgiven. And like, I will wipe your ass until the day you die, Mom, coming through. Like, I never thought, first of all, that I would come back and like live long-term in Seattle because, yeah, for lots of reasons. And we live like a mile away from my mom. I never thought that would be a fun thing for me, but it's been so great, so like the long game with parenting is the thing you got to hold on to when you're hanging on by your fingernails 100%. Is that it changes so much over time.
100%. I mean, I could see it now. I was a nightmare too. And my father passed away, 20 years ago. So I'll speak to my mother. So like I was a nightmare to her. And granted, some of that stuff might be quote unquote justifiable based on like childhood trauma. And so I might've been just reacting, but that reaction or lasted for several years into my young adulthood. And at some point we got to take accountability and responsibility for the trauma that's happened to us and do something about it as an adult. And not just be like, it's your fault, or someone else's fault, if we want to grow and change. And that's hard work by itself. But I did that work. And then through that and a bunch of other things, life throws its jokes at you, right? Like all the different crazy stuff that happens. And now I look back, and the person that you see before you, like my mom has come to, she's like, wow, Glenn, like I love who you are, and I love what you do in this world. I love all these great things but I could guarantee you that's not how she thought when I was, I don't even know, let's say 14 through 20 something at least, right?
Yeah.
And matter of fact, like she admittedly would take vacations to get away
Yeah.
for me as a teenager. Like her and my father would go to like Vegas for the weekend to be like, we just can't with you. And it was during a time of our generation or whatever, where that was told, like you left the kids, a teenager at home for a weekend. Like she was like, that was for us. Like,
Yeah.
but anyhow, yeah. So I get
resonate
that.
with that.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing, and yeah, it's a process, and it's what is it? It's not a sprint; it's a marathon or whatnot, and that's very true for this.
Yeah. And so then I guess my question is like, okay, I know as a clinician what it looks like to practice through burnout, and I feel more confident, I think, in that. Like I don't feel as intimidated by it, but maybe because I'm like sort of parent adjacent, right? Like I'm adjunct staff at home, right? And so I don't always have an intuitive sense of what my level of involvement is supposed to be. And so learning how to practice through burnout at home is something that I still feel like I'm like doing trial and error about in real time. And I'm wondering just like if you've had to practice through burnout as a parent and what that's looked like.
I've learned to have fun. You need to have fun with
Yes.
it. And that's really
That's
it. And laughter is a component of that. And so doing things like those drives I do with my daughter, those are fun. Like even though it's like sometimes it's like starting off with a not so good topic, we'll stop and get ice cream or cookies, or we'll go for a walk and through somewhere like a school at nighttime, which is kind of fun because it's like, oh, it's nighttime and no one's here, and it's like, it's cool. She likes that type of stuff. Or we'll go to a playground, or we'll go to a lake or whatever, like things that we enjoy. But the adventuring parts are fun. Like you have this youthful spirit that lives in your house, and you can take advantage. That could actually be a tool for you to be young again in a lot of ways. Like you want to go play basketball? Let's go shoot some hoops. Like you will destroy me probably, but like, hey, let's have some fun. That prevents burnout in a lot of ways. Boundaries.
Talk about it.
Yes. The greatest boundary that I've discovered as a parent that's been helpful is, so your listeners aren't going to see what I'm doing right now, but there's like a circle, an inner circle of like rules and regulations, so to speak, that I have for my child, that like what they can and can't do. But what my child doesn't know is that I actually have a bigger circle around that inner circle, meaning that like the inner circle is to provide structure and safety and guidance. And they think like, oh, like it's kids' job to be rebellious and break some of these rules and push some of these boundaries on a bunch of different levels. And she'll do that. Both of my children have done that, and I'm okay with that. And but I might not show that I'm okay with that because I'm like, oh, I'm disappointed, or like we need to talk about this. Like I said 9:00 to be home. It's 9:30. But in my head, the outer circle is like, if they're back tonight, I'm okay. Like, I will be fine. Yeah. And they're communicating with me. I will be okay. And I have a ton of examples like that. But that outer circle, for the most part, both of my children have remained within there with an exception of a few different isolated incidents. What that does for me as a parent is it provides the things I feel like I need to do and show up as, but it allows this leeway. That leeway in between the boundaries feels good for me because I'm like, I could still sleep at night and I could still relax and I could still enjoy myself because I know that even though they push through the inner boundary a lot, they're still within that bigger bubble or so to speak. And that helps me so much as a parent to relax, to be able to have fun.
Well, and I think a lot of times like what you're describing is like that kids want to know where the line is, right? And they also like, they get a little bit of sick pleasure out of pushing our buttons, right? And so like they're looking for a reaction. And part of the reason why I just like look up to you so much as a parent is because you don't react and you can sort of stay soft. I'm not at the point where I can stay soft, but I can at least like lock up most of my reaction. And like, I think there are areas where the fact that you're a clinician is such an asset, because I remember like when Mariah came home, what is it called within the juvenile system where like if they're truant from school, then they just automatically go to juvie? What is that called again? That's a gross overgeneralization.
So an ARY, an at-risk
youth
youth petition
That's
is
right.
filed, or CHIN's petition is along the same lines of child in need of services, but that's more like they need help, and an at-risk youth is more that the youth is behaving in a certain way where they can be held accountable for their delinquent behaviors, and the parent is not, because any parent that doesn't have that is liable for the children's behaviors.
Right.
So anyhow, yeah, an ARY.
Yeah. Well, and so like you know, in that outer circle of your boundaries, like I saw the ARI there when you were like, hey, look, like these are the values that we have, and this is what's okay and what's not okay.
Yeah.
And like, you're welcome to make choices, and these are the consequences.
Absolutely.
So like there's this saying of like, don't make threats that you don't intend to carry out in parenting that I think is really extremely helpful. Oh my God.
So as soon as I found out I was going to be a parent with Cynthia, so I think you touched on this before. Cynthia is not my biological child, but I didn't actually know that until she was like 3 years old.
Okay.
Suspicions were there, but I raised her as my own.
That's
Cut her
really
umbilical cord. Yeah. So there's a whole other story behind that. There's some Maury Povich or whatever stuff like that. But I will say that I learned early. So as soon as I found out I was going to be a parent, I changed my major into child developmental psychology.
Really?
Because I wanted to do this right. Like I was like, oh my God, like how am I going to do this? So I changed my major. I did that, and I learned something about what you just mentioned, which is like, don't make threats or don't make any kind of like that you're not going to back up.
Yeah.
And I practiced it, and oh my God, it was so helpful, because I remember the tantrums in a store, right? At 3, like I don't get what I want, they throw a little fit, and then I'm like, look, if you don't stop, we're out of here. Early on, I learned, we got out of there.
Yeah.
And like, even as inconvenient as it was for me to leave a basket full of groceries in the store, I'm like, I said that was it, and they see that, and they're like, oh, like this guy's for real. Like there's not just this is not an empty threat, so to speak, right? It's there will be a consequence. I'm like, that's it, we're out. Whether we're at Chuck E. Cheese, whether we're at the movies, wherever we're at, and you do it not even that many times. This is the beautiful part of it. Consistently 4 or 5 times, and then they get the message, and then you look and like you keep that up, we're out of here. Okay,
yeah,
that's it. Same thing with the 1, 2, like the count to 3. None of my kids have ever heard me make it to 3 when they were younger, because they learned early on, if he gets to 3, like there will be a consequence, and he will follow through with that. And that's not easy to do. But you got to be committed to that.
Yeah.
And I'm just talking, it's a lot easier when you have them at that younger developmental age. I couldn't imagine getting a child in adolescence and then being like, okay, we're going to learn this skill now, because that would just be so challenging. But still, you have to.
Yeah. Well, like, it's interesting because now what it looks like, and, I feel like over the years, we've been able to sort of like take it all in stride, and sort of like maybe we're workshopping as we go, but like, sort of figuring it out along the way, and it's worked okay to implement whatever consequence seemed appropriate. In this case, what made it so crazy was that, there were some shenanigans in the spring, and we were like, hey man, like we're not gonna bring the hammer down about this one, but if you lie to us again about anything like important, you just won't drive till you're 18.
Yeah.
Which is like that's a big
one. Yeah.
Threat,
yeah,
right?
It's a big threat.
It's a big fucking threat. And so we found out about some other shit right after he was signed up for driver's ed. And so my like entire internal rage blackout has been that like it's going to be more complex to carry out a threat than we initially thought.
Yes.
And like how to sort of make clear what the limits are, because I think for me, when I was growing up, I presented like such a good kid. And when I decided to rebel, it was a real fuck you to my parents and to like people in general, because I was just like really done trying to do it right because it wasn't panning out for me, and I was angry. And so I, even though I realize that it's very like myopic to see it this way, I filter actions through that lens where it's like, it's so easy to interpret it as a fuck you, right? And to say like, wow, this was pointed, and like, even if it's not only that, even if it's like a developmental imperative that they do that, like you still have to like not react to the fuck yous. And it's just, oh my God, I don't know if there are enough hours in the day to meditate to make that less hard. It is amazing.
I mean, the fact that it's super hard, and the fact that you're aware enough though to see your own role in it, where it's like your childhood experience and your rebellion, and that's the lens that you kind of look through when Jackson does something or something goes on. The fact that you could do that is already, you're ahead of the game. Because what that allows you to do as far as the next step, right, is to be like, okay, you're not me, like, and I'm not you. And what you're doing isn't a personal thing. It's a you thing. That's the next step to that awareness, right? And as soon as, that becomes more habitual or you practice it more, it just becomes easier to let go of not taking things so personal. And then, the consequences. I like that whole, I forget the analogy with water being fluid.
Bridge?
No, not under the bridge, but being more powerful than rock, right?
Ooh.
Because after the waterfall will make a path through a rock over time. But yet be like water is what they say, that because it's stronger, but it's also fluid.
Yeah.
I mean, same thing goes with a lot. So learning how to that balance, though, to like, here's a consequence, being stern, but there's certain things you need to be fluid with, including how you do it. One thing I learned in my own therapy with my children was when they have a consequence for an action, and once that consequence is served, that thing is done. And that took me a lot, because I would be like, well, remember that? You did this and you did that and you did that.
Yeah.
And then it would drive my kids mad. And then it came out in family therapy where the therapist is like, hey, if they've served their time, then they're good.
Yeah.
Meaning that, like, if the consequence for, let's just say, coming home late is to lose your phone for a day. Okay, you came home late, past curfew, you lose your phone privileges for a day. That's an agreed situation or consequence. Once that's done, here's your phone. Have a good day. I love you. What are we doing today?
Totally.
And it's like almost like it never happened.
Totally.
And that has been really great.
Yeah, I love that. I have a colleague when we talk about medicine who says, like, if a patient is not in the hospital, you have time to like try stuff, and I think over time, approaching people's medical cases, I have learned there's a lot of pressure on physicians to like really just never fuck up because the stakes are so high sometimes if you do. And I think the thing that I've learned is even when we make these human errors, like it's actually pretty fucking hard to kill somebody, And like you almost have to try because the malintent or like the gross negligence, with the exception of like some really one-off cases, that has helped me sort of like be less terrified as a person who is like being entrusted to have someone's life in their hands. And I feel that way as a parent too, where like some of it in terms of like being able to kind of hold these actions and these reactions more loosely is to just know, to like trust that they're gonna be okay, or to like learn to live with the possibility that shit might not be okay. And that's always true, And so like we can't rob our serenity for the sake of preventing every bad thing from happening, no matter how much we want to make sure that they never encounter some crazy, awful shit. Like we just can't. No.
100%. And again, that awareness will take you far. It never turns out how we expect or how we want.
No.
It never does. And once you could accept that allows us a lot more grace in itself.
Because
For sure. It's like, you're not going to be the person I exactly want you to be, and you're not going to respond exactly the way I want you to respond, and you're not going to follow my rules exactly the way I want you to follow my rules, so on and so on. Yeah. And as soon as we could kind of be okay with that, because in our own lives, like we ended up in places that we probably didn't foresee, and we went through things that we didn't expect, but we seemed to turn out just fine, and that's how life works. And so that's a universal truth, so to speak.
Totally.
Once we kind of let go and let it relax a little and stuff, it's just, and have more fun with it, because life's so fun. Like parenting is like beautiful and fun. Living is fun. Exploring is fun. Adventuring is fun. The connection is like, it's just so much beautiful things. And if we could just focus on that, it just kind of switches the lens a little.
Yeah, it really like is worth prioritizing that part of it. And for me, like for this control freak, what I tell people is that like everything I have let go of has claw marks all over it. And so like there is this part of my own internal process where I just know I am waiting for some part of me that's clenched to get tired, because I cannot make myself let go before like something spontaneously just shifts on its own. Like, you know, you do all the footwork and the therapy and the processing and the just like enjoying what you can in the meantime. And then just like on some fucking Tuesday, I'll be like, oh, that thing doesn't bug me anymore. Weird.
Nice.
When did that happen? You know? And so it's like the water of like just life doing what it does and not giving a fuck about me has like kind of worked in the background. Like, you know, when my husband goes on climbing adventures, he like tries to reassure me by saying that he has all of the gear and the training. And I'm like, oh, honey, nature doesn't give a shit about you. I don't feel reassured by that at all, you know? And so I think for me, part of the cosmic joke is that like on the one hand, life is doing what life does. And I am inconsequential to that process. And that puts things in perspective for me. And then on the other hand, I feel like, I don't know, like forces really tend to like rally around people who are courageous enough to like own their shit, you know? And so if I can just commit to doing that, even if it is very clunky, like I have to trust that that's enough even on the worst day where I just like really, the perfectionism is raging and I feel like I'm not doing enough because I haven't fixed it. Like, it is enough because I showed up for it, you know?
Absolutely.
Ooh.
No, you're speaking some deep truth right there. And what you're talking about is creating a lifestyle or a way of being that allows for the change to happen with the least amount of conflict, which is like the dream.
Yeah.
That's how we want it, because the cycle of change, it usually works like you become so miserable that you like, I need this to change, whatever the situation, or some outside power or source will come in and like change everything for you. Or then there's what you just described, which is kind of being open and fluid and allowing the change to seep in the proper spaces, and it'll happen like kind of naturally. And that's such a nice way to do it, because who wants to be miserable to the point where that's when you make your change? Or who wants some thing to come in and be like, okay, car accident just happened, I can't walk anymore, you're forced to change, you know, or whatever, fill in that scenario with any situation, as opposed to what you're describing. And so that's, to me, you're on track, like, you're doing your thing, honestly. And it's a process, because like there's no one that, especially if you're a perfectionist or type A personality or any of the things that make it like it needs to be my way, like I get that, but that you're open to that now you're going through it. Like you're allowing the good things to happen. Yeah.
Sometimes I've told Jackson when he doesn't want to do something, I'm like, oh, that's fine. You don't have to like it. You just have to do it, you know? And like I'm glad that perspective is in there when shit is not happening the way that I want it to happen, because like I remember that it doesn't I don't have to like it. I just have to show up for it, you know? And that actually takes a lot of the pressure off, ironically.
It does.
You know?
It does. Taking the pressure off is great, because we carry a lot of unnecessary pressure.
We do. Yeah.
Which creates stress and anxiety and all the things that we don't need. They're not so productive.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Yeah.
So I feel like, even on my worst day, I feel like if I just know that it's because I don't get the joke yet, but like I have a little bit of hope that it's in there somewhere because I've seen the joke become funny before, that kind of allows me to hang in there when it's all happening.
And like, first of all, I love the concept of your podcast and the title, The Cosmic Joke, because yes, like that even approach towards life or hardships or learning or our journey is such a great way to look at things, because it's like you got to see the humor in it, and you got to see that it's not the way we plan things and how it works out. But I just love the concept completely. So that's really, I think that's going to help you on your journey as well, because it's just like, here you are doing this podcast about the things that are difficult.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I'm glad you like it. I kind of stumbled into it by accident, because you know, I grew up in a really religious house, and it was also super dysfunctional. And so I had this kind of conflation between a higher power and all of this trauma. And it took me realizing that like the cosmic joke was something that initially I felt like I could use as like a stand-in for a higher power when I felt like I didn't trust anything else. Because the thing that I like about it is that even though it is painful as fuck sometimes, like there's benevolence in it, because transformation is possible if you just hang in there through it.
100%.
You know?
100%.
Like when you're going through hell, for God's sake, don't stop.
No, 100%. Yeah, the journey and pushing through it and is a big part of what it's about. But you won't get the results unless you do that. You know, you need to go on the journey. You need to push through that hardship. And like you said, if you're in hell, like keep going.
Yeah.
Right. Like that, and that's been my experience to the point. Yeah. Like we're now. I don't want to say I run towards a challenge because sometimes I don't feel like the energy to do that.
Yeah.
But like certain challenges come up and I'm like, okay, there's this voice now that I've been doing it so often that tells me face this challenge, take on this new journey. Someone asked, like when you asked me to come do this, I was happy to do this. But today in particular, I had gotten through this crazy hike last night. I didn't get home till midnight and I canceled all my other plans except for this one.
Hey.
Right. Because, and it's because I'm like, well, I made a commitment, but also part of self-care is like knowing like, okay, I made a commitment, but like, but
These
I
are my
knew like
limits.
this was great and it was good and it didn't require much physical action. On my part. So, and it's not being video recorded. So I didn't have to like dress up nice or shave.
You're
So
lounging.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all those, and just, I'm glad that I did it though, because like here we are doing this thing, having this great conversation for this this vision that you have. And to be a part of that's amazing for me. So I'm happy that I did it. But I remember that first part of me was like, I could maybe call her and say like, hey, can we reschedule? I'd rather just stay in bed. And I know you probably been totally graceful with that. And we would have rescheduled and been just fine. But pushing yourself, right? Going through, making it a little bit of a challenge and not that big of a challenge, obviously, to, drive here and do this thing. It's been great.
I don't know. Woodinville's far.
It is. It was a good, I don't know, 45-minute drive. I don't know. But
I can't believe you said that. Like, it's no big deal.
Yeah,
Like, if it's more than 8 minutes, I'm going to be such a baby about it.
Yeah, no, I'm learning. That's another thing I'm learning is a drive. When it's funny, this is totally off topic, but when I go on vacation and I drive somewhere, like I went to Hawaii recently and I was like, I'll look up a good hike and I'm like 2 hours one way. And I'm like, oh, no big deal. I'm like, well, why don't I do that here?
Yeah.
Like more often? Because I'm like, why do I wait till a vacation to go like some long drive to do something cool when I live in this state where it has so much of that beautiful stuff within an hour or two away?
Yeah.
So,
well, I feel like you do a pretty good job of making the most of it.
I try.
You do.
I try, yeah.
Well, and thank you for making the drive out here today. It was so fun to chat with you.
Yes.
This was the best.
Yeah.
I hope we get to do it again soon.
Yeah, me too. And I can't wait to see the end result of all this. And I know it'll be great.
You're the best.
Yay.
Thanks again, Glenn.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Sometimes you're the windshield and sometimes you're the bug. Tell me your cosmic joke story on Instagram at thisisthecosmicjoke.podcast or email us at doyougetthejokeyet@gmail.com. It just might get read on the air. Please rate, review, share, and subscribe when you visit us. And you can check out our website at doyougetthejokeyet.com. This podcast is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. Do you get the joke yet? See you next time.